Jeremiah here with Jacob Sullum, who is a syndicated columnist and a longtime contributor to Reason and Forbes magazine, who has written extensively on the drug war. Jacob, good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I wanted to speak with you about what's happening in Washington, D.C. The legalization drive there, Initiative 71, of course, passed with a landslide victory. It was 70+%. The ballot initiative would have legalized marijuana in the District of Columbia if, indeed, it gets through the hurdles it has to pass, the Congress and the other things that are going on right now. And that's where it gets a little complicated because there's this new rider in a funding bill aimed at stopping it, or we thought it was aimed at stopping it. Now we're not so sure. Jacob, I'm hoping you can walk us through some of this stuff.
I will try. So the intent of the guy who added this rider, his name is Andy Harris, he's a Republican congressman from Maryland, his intent was to stop Initiative 71 from taking effect.
Right.
But the language that he used may not accomplish that, because the language that he used refers to using money, whether federal funds or local funds, to enact a measure that legalizes or decriminalizes a Schedule I drug. So the question is, what does enact mean? And I think there's a pretty strong argument that when it was approved by voters, 70% of them on Election Day, it was enacted. There is a congressional review process for any law that is passed by the district, where Congress has 30 legislative days once it's submitted to decide whether they want to override it. That rarely happens. But the effect of that is that the new law takes effect. It's not that the law is enacted. And in fact, if you look at the language in the District of Columbia Home Rule Act, which is the law that governs this whole process, it says that if Congress does in fact pass a resolution, it's a joint resolution of disapproval, and it's signed by the President within the 30 legislative days, then that has the effect of repealing the law. Well, you can't repeal a law unless it's already been enacted. So clearly, under the Home Rule Act, the idea is that either the D.C. Council or the voters through a referendum is passing a law that is then enacted, but then may subsequently be repealed if Congress chooses to do that. So since this rider only talks about preventing D.C. from enacting a law, it looks like this has already been enacted, so it's too late for that. And that is the argument that Eleanor Holmes Norton, the D.C.'s delegate in Congress, has made. It is the same reasoning has been endorsed by several Democratic leaders in the House who were involved in the negotiations over this bill, so they ought to know something about it. On the other hand, the Republicans who backed this rider are claiming that no, this would stop the initiative from taking effect. I think they're probably wrong, the Republicans, that is. I haven't seen a persuasive argument that a D.C. law is not enacted until it passes the congressional review process. The effect of the review process is either to let it take effect, which happens automatically, or if Congress actually decides to act within the specified time period, then it repeals the law. So that means the law has already been enacted.
Right, so it's really about this word enacting or enacted. Now, it's a strange thing that it's kind of a semantical argument here, I guess, really between the Republicans and the Democrats. But yeah, it makes sense, though, that it would be, of course, enacted because the next stage, so say if this rider hadn't have been put in there, the next stage would be that they actually have to look at it to either let it pass or repeal it. And so without it being enacted, it just can't, there's no way to repeal something that hasn't been enacted.
Right, and if Congress does nothing, it takes effect. That's it. It does not require any additional legislation from Congress or from the D.C. Council. So the effect of this initiative, which is to get rid of penalties applying to certain specified marijuana-related activities, right? So it's possession up to 2 ounces in public, it's growing up to 6 plants at home, it's sharing on a non-commercial basis with other people. It repeals the penalties for all those things, and it doesn't. Once it takes effect, that's it. You don't need any additional legislation. It's what they call self-executing, right? So, given that, I think that the Democrats have the better of this argument, and it's actually interesting if you look at why it was that Andy Harris changed his rider, because he tried this once before last summer summer when he was trying to reverse the decriminalization of marijuana in D.C. D.C. changed possession of up to an ounce from a misdemeanor to a civil offense where you could get a $25 fine. Right. He didn't like that, so he inserted language that was quite similar to this language, except that it said to enact or carry out. And his idea was that would have the effect of reversing this decriminalization measure. I'm not sure it would have actually, but that was his idea. And he said the reason he took out carry out from the new version is that he didn't want to imply that this would reverse the decriminalization measure. So in other words, he's already thrown in the towel on that. He's not trying to reverse that anymore. Right. But by making that crucial change in the language, he may have crippled the impact of the whole thing.
Right. Well, now, so this bill, or the rider then, so say the Democrats are right on this one, what does the rider actually do then?
Well, it would stop, one thing that I think is clear is it would stop the district from passing new legislation to regulate marijuana businesses. The initiative does not do that. The initiative, because of the restrictions that D.C. puts on what can be accomplished by initiative, you can only do certain kinds of legal changes, in particular ones that involve allocating new money, which would be necessary for regulation, you can't do by initiative. Because of those restrictions, the initiative itself only legalizes the things I mentioned: possession, home cultivation, sharing, right, for adults 21 or older. If you want to actually have a source of marijuana other than home cultivation, then you have to do something like Colorado has done or Washington has done, which is create a system where you have legal marijuana businesses that are growing or selling it. And there actually is a bill that the D.C. Council has been considering already that would do that. It would assign the responsibilities to their local liquor control board. And it would be a process that would take some time. It would be probably a couple of years before the store started opening, because they have to write the regulations, and they have about 6 months to do that, and they have to accept applications from people, and of course you need time to actually grow and establish these businesses and so forth. So it would take a while, but that would basically be stopped by this rider, at least through the end of the fiscal year, which is through next September. D.C. would not be allowed to proceed with that legislation, because that does involve enacting a new thing, right? It's enacting regulation, enacting a law that tells the Liquor Control Board to write these regulations and start accepting license applications. So it would stop that, which would mean that assuming the initiative takes effect, basically you would have to be, assuming you want to stay within the law, and of course a lot of people are just going to buy from their usual sources, but assuming they want to be completely legal about it, people will either be growing their own or they'll be getting it from friends or acquaintances, which is legal under Initiative 71.
Right, and the way it does this is by denying it funding, essentially, and that's the way the language is in the rider.
Right.
It says it's not, they're not allowed to...
Basically, it's all the, when they do riders with the appropriations bills, it's phrased in terms of you may not spend money, and in this case it's both local and federal money, on whatever the thing is they don't want to happen. And, any function of the government pretty much involves some kind of expenditure of money. Certainly creating this system, this new regulatory system, licensing and regulation system would involve, spending money. Unless Congress, unless it gets rid of that rider, which is possible at for the next fiscal year, they're not going to be able to have commercial cultivation and distribution.
Right. So now, of course, though, if the Republicans are correct about this one, which at this point it looks like they got it wrong on this one, right? How do we find out whether that's true or not? Actually,
that is an excellent question. The local attorney, what they call Attorney General for D.C., that office is looking at this issue, so they're going to presumably come up with a position. The city attorney's office will probably come up with a position. If Congress disagrees, then there could be litigation over it, right? So if the congressional leaders are Republicans, and if they decide, no, we think this means you cannot, the initiative can't take effect, then you would have a legal dispute that may end up in court. Assuming the district takes the opposite view, which I assume they're going to.
Right. Wow. So it's quite a complicated situation there. Now, the other element here is the White House has indicated that Obama will support this funding bill, no matter what it is got in it.
Right.
Yesterday, when it was looking like it was actually going to kill the initiative, there was some criticism of Obama about the whole thing. But the White House actually didn't they criticize the Republicans for adding that language in there?
They did, and previously, when Andy Harris tried to pass that earlier rider that I mentioned, where he was trying to reverse decriminalization, the Obama administration also criticized him and said, this is not appropriate, you shouldn't be trying to meddle with the district's policy choices. So it was pretty clear that the president was opposed to this sort of thing, although, the actual measure involved is slightly different, but the general principle is that they should be able to decide, have their own policies. And I think, that's a reason, one of the reasons to think that it would be quite difficult to actually get a resolution of this passed, because that requires not only getting both houses of Congress to approve it, but the president has to sign it, and that's a standalone piece of legislation. It's not like this bill where you've got a million things in it, many of which the Democrats want and many of which Obama wants. You would have a bill that would do only one thing, which would be to overturn marijuana legalization in D.C. And in that case, even if the Republicans wanted to take this on in January, and it's not clear that they do, that this would be a high priority for them, and even if they could get both houses of Congress to approve it, which is also not clear because there are not just a lot of Democrats, but a fair number of Republicans who don't think the federal government should be meddling in this. Even if they could get it passed, it still would have to be signed by Obama, and he's given every indication that he would veto it.
Right. Now, there's, as a little aside to this whole thing, I guess we just have to kind of wait for the Attorney General there to sort of figure this out and see what happens. If it did, you said that it could go to court. If it was something like that, would we be looking at a long procedure for this, or is this something that would be dealt with fairly quickly?
I honestly don't know. I think if the Republicans decide that they're determined to override this initiative, and the district challenges that they might, Republicans might cave if there's an initial ruling in favor of the district. They might decide to go along with that, or they might not. So it's hard to say. It depends on how determined the Republicans are to block Initiative 71 from taking effect. And honestly, I don't think they really want to do that. I don't think they want to spend all the time or effort doing that. And this was part of Harris's calculation in inserting the rider that we did at the very end of the session when everybody's desperate to get this measure passed. There was no real debate about it. Anything. It was just sort of these backdoor or backroom negotiations with the Democrats. It would be I think that part of his calculation was that the Republican leadership isn't really interested in taking this up in January as one of their first acts, in the new Congress when they're going to control, even though they would be controlling both houses, in charge of the Senate as well as the House. I think that that was part of what he was thinking, is that the Republican leaders really aren't all that gung-ho about overriding this.
Right, and that was, you called your article, "Rider Aimed at Stopping Marijuana Legalization in Washington, D.C. Reflects Prohibitionist Weakness," and I guess that's what you're referring to there. And
another thing I guess I should point out, which I mentioned in the article, is that this very same bill, the one that has the rider that is aimed at overturning Initiative 71, includes another rider, and this one actually got a vote from the full House, that was introduced by Dana Rohrabacher, who's another Republican, but this one is coming at this issue from completely the opposite direction, and it's telling the federal government not to interfere with marijuana policy choices made by D.C., specifically says D.C. and the states, with reference to medical marijuana. So, and that measure got a majority in the House, and it attracted, I think, it was about almost 50 Republicans who voted for that. So what I read that to mean is that these are 50 or so Republicans who are saying, whatever our opinion about whether marijuana is a good medicine or whether the states should be doing this, the federal government should leave it to states and D.C. in that case, because they specifically mentioned D.C. So that to me, is an indicator that within the Republican Party there are people who support local control, who think that the decision should be made at the lowest possible level. And then, even though, strictly speaking, the Constitution doesn't require it in the case of D.C., because D.C. is sort of this congressional protectorate, right? It's complete control over it. Even though the Constitution doesn't require it, I think that there are Republicans who can see the logic of, if we let states decide these issues for themselves, why shouldn't D.C. decide, these issues as well?
Now, this is the one that restricts the Department of Justice and the Drug Enforcement Administration from using taxpayer funds to interfere in basically medical marijuana programs in the 20 states
Right.
that have them, right? 20 plus states.
Yeah. So, and it, like I said, it mentioned not only but D.C. specifically. So there clearly is some sentiment among Republicans in support of the view that D.C. as well as the states should be able to make its own decisions with regard to marijuana policy, which I find encouraging. And you have new additional Republicans coming into the House, a fair number of whom may be inclined in that direction because they are federalists and they conservatives who believe the federal government should not be interfering willy-nilly everywhere. And the Republicans will be in control of the Senate as well. But there are probably at least a few Republican senators already have indicated publicly that they're not inclined to interfere in this sort of thing. Rand Paul probably has made the clearest statement saying D.C. should be free to do as it chooses and the federal government should not interfere, specifically with reference to marijuana legalization. But also Pat Roberts from Kansas and Ron Johnson have said that this is an issue that should be left to the states, so that leaves open the question of whether it applies to D.C. as well. But they've indicated that that whatever their views about marijuana, they don't think the federal government should be trying to impose prohibition in jurisdictions that have rejected it.
Right, exactly. Well, Jacob, I really appreciate you coming on the show today, helping us figure out the details of the situation. I'd definitely love to talk to you again when we figure out more about the whole thing. And, of course, people can read your article, Rider Aimed at Stopping Marijuana Legalization in Washington, D.C. Reflects Prohibitionist Weakness at Forbes magazine. There's a link to it on the front of cannabisculture.com right now. Jacob, thanks a lot for coming on.
Sure, thank you.